Well, hello all, and welcome to Harper's SME Sustainability Clinic. I'm Andrew Catchpole, editor of Harper's, and today we've teamed up with sustainability consultant Jeremy Rockett of Rocket Science to look at achievable steps that smaller businesses can take to advance their sustainable credentials. Now, as we are all too aware these days, embracing a sustainable agenda has never been more important for the future health of any given business. But for many small and medium-sized companies, that can also seem a daunting task when pitted against the day-to-day challenges of operating and without the resources and deeper pockets of larger rivals. This is where our clinic aims to step up to the mark, delivering advice to business owners and operators on how best to advance sustainability in manageable ways. And this session forms part of the larger sustainability drive anchored by Harper's Sustainability Charter, encouraging drinks businesses to sign up and share their progress in a transparent and mutually beneficial way. And if you haven't already done so, please do go online and check out our dedicated charter website at harperssustainabilitycharter.co.uk. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Jeremy now in just a moment, but a quick word on housekeeping. We're looking for an interactive session, so please do use the Q&A function to pose questions as we go along, and we'll endeavour to answer as many as we can. We'll either answer as we go if they're incredibly pertinent to what's been said, but there'll be ample opportunity at the end as well to address questions that have yet to be answered. Okay, Jeremy, over to you, and morning, and good to see you. And by way of introduction, would you like to say a few words about your own sort of journey into sustainability, into the area of sustainability? Great.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Good morning, everybody. Yeah, just a little bit of background. I was, until the middle of last year, running a company that I owned, a distribution company, mainly spirits, importing from all over the world and distributing into the UK. And we were being asked questions by customers as simple as, what's your position on sustainability? And we didn't even know where to start with an answer. In fact, I didn't even know what sustainability meant. I knew kind of roughly what it meant, but as a concept, but I had no way of putting that into a structured format. I left that company and then did some studying and did a qualification in sustainability, just to really understand how to break that down, and then set up an agency helping small businesses with sustainability and helping businesses answer that question. So today, hopefully, we're going to do a little bit of background on what sustainability is, and then talk about some real practical measures that you can take to improve your sustainability. But I would say this is just the start of the journey. There's no quick and easy way to make your business sustainable. It's a long process.
Yeah, I think that can seem daunting, can't it? It's a little bit like the wine and spirit world. You dive in and you realize with little knowledge that how much more there is to know, but that doesn't make it insurmountable. I think that's what Jeremy is going to take us through today. So
exactly, yeah, I think it can be daunting, and I've approached today on the basis that people probably know nothing. So if you know something already, I apologise if I'm telling you something you already know, but I've got to work on the basis of where I was in the middle of last year. So we'll kick off, shall we, Andrew?
Yep, excellent. And it's just in response to that, it's always, I think, good to be working off the same obvious.
Yeah. Andrew, can you confirm you can see that?
I can, yes, it's clear and full screen, thanks. Yes.
Good, okay. So I thought I'd start with just a sort of an introduction. It's a massive subject. We're not going to be able to cover everything today. I learn something new every single day, every hour of every day. It's a huge subject, and there are people out there have been studying this for years. So we're just going to scratch the surface today. And there's three parts to sustainability, which we will cover in a second. But most of today is to focus on the environmental factors, which will help focus it a little bit. Hopefully, I'm not going to use any jargon. I hate jargon. Please ask if you see any jargon or there's something you don't understand. There are a few concepts I'll introduce, which I will go through further down the line. But if there's anything I say that you don't understand, please ask. Also, every business is different. This process is the same. So I'm going to use some examples which may not apply to you. But as long as you go through the standard process, you'll find things that will apply to your business. You can't do everything. So my message would be do the things that make a difference. And nobody has all the answers. And you'd be amazed. I work with a lot of companies, and I've questioned a lot of environmental specialists, and there's a huge amount of a huge number of gaps in people's information. So you might be being asked by your customers questions that you can't answer, but it might be that nobody can answer those questions. So don't be disheartened, as a lot of people in the same ignorant state as the rest of us. I thought I'd start also with some good news. You hear a lot about sustainability for the UK, and I just thought I'd show you a few figures just to set the context. In the UK, we've reduced our carbon emissions by 40% since 1991. That's incredible. And whatever's happened with the pandemic and the banking crisis since that time, the economy has grown, and we've reduced our UK carbon emissions. But it's mainly through closing coal-fired power stations that are making electricity that we all use. You can't close any more coal-fired power stations because they're very rarely used, only when there's extreme weather or extreme need. So there's a couple still open, but they can't be cut any further. So it's down to the rest of us to start working out how to cut our emissions. And just for the people that don't like renewables, I'm sure there's nobody here, but that just shows you the last 12 months, 66% of our energy needs in the UK came from non-fossil fuel sources. Whether you think nuclear is sustainable or not, that's part of our mix. But solar, wind has been growing. Hydroelectric's been growing and is going to grow further, as is biomass. So there are days when a significant amount more than that of our electricity comes from renewables, particularly on very windy days. So, we are getting there as a country, but not, as you can see, we're still very, very reliant on gas. And that's the thing that, to a certain extent, will be taken over by renewables, but to a certain extent, it's down to us to cut our electricity consumption to help reduce those numbers. So, what is sustainability? This is the question that we could never answer. This definition is from the UN, from the Brundtland Commission, named after a female Norwegian Prime Minister who came up with this definition. And the definition is meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So this is about using the resources we have available to us, but making sure there's something left for our kids and our grandchildren. And traditionally, that's seen as having three pillars. One is environmental, which you would expect. One is economical and one is social. The social element is the fact that it's fine to do everything nice for the environment, but we still need to make sure that people are okay. Because if you haven't got people to make things and buy things in the future, then what's the point? And it's the same with economical. If you are, if you look after the environment to the extreme that your business goes bust because you're doing everything for the environment, then what's the point? So sustainability has to encompass looking after people, looking after the environment, and making sure that we can survive as an economy or as individual businesses. And as I say, we'll go more into the environmental today than anything else. It's not just about climate change. Obviously, greenhouse gases are important, but it's about lots of other things as well. So it's about waste. We all know about recycling, reuse, but if you can cut down on waste to start with, that's probably that's the best solution. It's about things like what packaging and materials you use, which obviously lead on to waste. It's about traceability. Are the things that you're buying from the right sources? It's about water usage. Now, we think we don't have water shortages in the UK. We've had a drought at the end of last year. There's about to be one announced this year. So we do, even in this country, we have water problems. But it's also about all the other things we mentioned about social, like training and development, ethical business practices, charity support. That's a whole host of things you can include in sustainability. And when you look at some companies that are doing this well and look at their sustainability reports, it covers all these different areas and sometimes even more. But as I say, today we're going to focus much more on the environmental side, which is about waste, greenhouse gases, packaging materials, those kind of things. But please don't ignore the other bits and pieces. Well, why would you do it? I think there's a bit of a sometimes a bit of a suspicion that environmental sustainability is costly and is going to cost you money. And there are things you can do that are investments that in the short term might cost you money, but there are some real benefits as well. Financially, if you save energy, you save cost. And right now, if you save energy, you're going to save a lot of cost. So reducing energy is a good thing to do for any business, but efficiency in any resource you use is going to reduce cost. Even in water usage, there's a greenhouse gas element to water usage, but also you pay for your water usage. Sometimes you pay for your waste disposal, so cutting waste is also useful. But there's a risk management side to this as well. If you don't make these changes and energy costs go up, it's going to cost you even more, or water or waste disposal. And it's likely that some of those costs will go up in the future. I've got a colleague or a friend who runs a company in Belgium making pate. He put in solar some time ago. He wins over his competitors' tenders all the time because his cost base is much lower because he's producing his own electricity, and it's a very energy heavy business. So there is a competitive advantage in the short term as well. There's a legal benefit or a compliance benefit. Currently in the UK, if you turn over more than 36 million, and there are some other caveats, or you're in a restricted industry, you are legally obliged to measure your carbon footprint, set targets for reduction, and to reduce your impact on the environment. That is likely to change. That 36 million turnover is likely to come down over time. So hopefully your businesses are growing, and if that starts to come down, you're going to come up against that compliance benchmark. But also, everybody's under pressure from customers, and this is what got me started, was customers saying, what's your position on sustainability? Because if you're supplying a big company over 36 million turnover, you'll see in a minute how your carbon footprint and your environmental impact affects their environmental impact if they're buying from you. So we're all being asked more and more from our customers, but also our employees and other stakeholders to demonstrate our environmental credentials. And then finally, reputational. Not only are customers asking about sustainability, there was a survey recently showed that 77% of employees want more transparency from their businesses on its environmental impact. And if I talk to people at HR, they say that employees are more and more asking, or candidates are asking more and more about sustainability, and they're interested in joining companies that are more sustainable. So if you have good practices, you're much more likely to attract good staff and retain them. And also there is green finance available only to companies who pass certain benchmarks. So this is going to increase over time. One thing I would say is there's a lot of, you might think there's a competitive advantage to sustainability. If you talk to, people like Andrew, people like the Sustainable Wine Roundtable, what they'll talk about is we'll only get there as a country if we cooperate with each other. So whilst you might see there are some competitive advantages of being sustainable early, I would suggest that the best thing to do is share, because we all want to have a better environment around us. So those advantages will all smooth out as more and more companies go on their sustainability journey. So if you were to go on this journey, one of the first things you'll do as a company is an environmental audit. And this is where we start to get a bit technical. And one of the first things you'll think about is your greenhouse gas emissions, which, in other words, your carbon footprint. I've put a little bit of jargon in there, scope 1 to 3, but I'm going to cover that in a second. But this is measured as carbon dioxide equivalent. So it takes all the gases that might be in your supply chain and in your business and turns that into carbon dioxide equivalents. And there is a set of government conversion factors which you can look up. They're on the government website, which tell you for every mile you drive in a certain car, for every ton you deliver in a truck of goods, however, whatever kilowatt hours of electricity you're using in your business, you can look at those conversion factors and you can work out what your carbon footprint is. not suggesting that you do it, because it is quite complicated, but it is available to everybody and freely available. You'll also look at waste and recycling, and one of the measures you might look at is your percentage of waste that goes into landfill versus what you recycle, and we'll talk about some techniques in a minute to help reduce that. You'll look at water usage, which, as I mentioned, also contributes to greenhouse gas emissions, but there is a cost to that. Most of you are probably paying by the unit for water. And you look at energy usage, which is closely tied to greenhouse gas emissions. And then there's the big one, which is supply chain and procurement. And I'll sort of develop that a little bit more in a second, because that's often the thing that everybody looks at first. So just as promised, looking at those scopes. So your greenhouse gas emissions are split into 3 separate areas: Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3. Scope 1 is your direct emissions from your company. Pretty much this is any fuel you burn within your company environment. So if you've got gas in your kitchens, or you've got company cars that you own that are using fuel, diesel or petrol cars, office heating that is using gas or oil, any fuel that in a building that you rent or own, or a car that you own, that you burn, they are your Scope 1 direct emissions. The only thing you would add to that is air conditioning, not the cost of it through electricity, but any top-ups you do, because if you top up your office air conditioning, it means you've lost some gas to the environment, and that's going to have an effect. So those are fairly easy to work out. Scope 2 are your indirect emissions, which is almost entirely from your electricity supply. So all the electricity you use in your business. And again, there are tables to work that out. It's probably the easiest thing to work out, because you know what your annual consumption is. You multiply it by the factor and you get the emission. But it also includes any company-owned vehicles that are electric that you're topping up somewhere else. So on the motorway or at somebody's home. All those, that might sound daunting, some of that, but it's not as daunting as Scope 3, which is everything else. So it's your staff driving to the office. It's business travel, whether that's going on a plane to visit a supplier, or any kind of business traveling between premises. It's all upstream and downstream transport and distribution. So lorries delivering to your premises, lorries delivering from your premises. It could be a ship coming from Australia full of pallets of wine. All the waste generated in your operations, anything you buy for your business, paper, consumables in a restaurant, anything you buy, and anything you then throw away, all those things are covered by Scope 3. And this is where it gets complicated, because most of those things, or many of those things, you don't control. It's hard to influence, and it's incredibly hard to measure. So you can measure your employee commuting. If people claim expenses, it's quite easy to turn that into a carbon figure. Business travel's relatively easy, but how do you account for all those things that you buy? And whether you're a distributor or whether you're a restaurant or a retailer, a bottle of wine that you buy that's come from Australia has a hugely complicated supply chain in terms of its carbon emissions, because you're having to, in theory, go right back to the vineyard and work out what the liquid cost is and what the packaging cost is in terms of carbon emissions, and then adding that up together into all your purchases. And this is where I was saying earlier, you can't necessarily cover everything today, because even the largest companies don't have a handle on all this information. So if you get a form from Tesco or EasyJet or a restaurant chain that's saying, can you tell me your Scope 3 carbon emissions, you are unlikely to be able to supply a full number for your Scope 3 carbon emissions. But don't worry about it, because nobody else can. And again, whether you're a retailer, whether you're a restaurant, whether you're a distributor, a wholesaler, you might think sustainability is everything about what you buy and sell. It's also about the cost of your operation. It's the Scope 1 and the Scope 2. And that's the place to start, because you have to do those or you will have to do those in the future, but those are the things that you can control, and those are the things that the place where you should start. The scope 3, the best thing to do is to say, I'm going to look at these things. I'm going to look at employee commuting. I'm going to look at business travel, because I can understand those and I can influence those. I might look at upstream and downstream transport because they're relatively easy, but I'm not going to look at the carbon impact of the bottle of wine I bought from Australia today, because actually my supplier can't even tell me. And there's no way you can work that out because you don't have the data. So it is about starting the journey somewhere and accepting the fact that there are going to be a lot of big gaps in what you can do, and what your suppliers can tell you. When you do this exercise, it's underpinned by a number. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol states a number of sort of standards that you should bear in mind when you're doing it. What you should do should be relevant. It should be complete as much as you can. It should be consistent. That means from year to year, for example. The key things, it should be transparent and it should be accurate. If you're going to exclude something and you do a report on your business, say what you've excluded. Nobody minds as long as you're transparent, and you should be as accurate as possible. So you should use what they call primary data where you can. But if you can't, sometimes you have to make an estimate. I suspect this probably might have blown everyone's mind, because it blew my mind. But if anyone's got any questions, fire them in. But we'll go on to some practical things you can do in a moment, so that we're not worrying about bottles of wine coming from Australia.
Yeah, I think just to jump in, Jeremy, I think a key point there is what you're saying about you do what you can practically do, and it's that there's so much that potentially needs to be done, but don't be put off, don't be scared off by the fact that, you know, where the hell do I start? Just start on perhaps some of the sort of lower hanging fruit. I think that's really important.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll just put a couple of slides in here just explaining some terms that you might hear. So what is net zero? We hear about UK is going to be at net zero by 2050. What does that actually mean? And also what's offsetting? And you might not have even heard of insetting. The UN definition of net zero is to cut your greenhouse gas emissions as close as possible to zero, with any remaining emissions reabsorbed from the atmosphere, for example, by oceans and forests. If I gave an example, we'll talk about greenwashing in a minute, but I heard a story about somebody going into a big bank with a glass and steel building that had lovely heating in the winter, air conditioning in the summer, lots of nice lighting, and they were saying how that it was a net zero building. Net zero isn't about offsetting all your nasty carbon emissions and then being happy about it. If you're driving a diesel car down the road, and a particularly old one, you shouldn't feel smug if you've offset all those emissions by planting trees. You're still putting things into the atmosphere that your children are breathing in. So it is about cutting your emissions as much as you can and then offsetting the rest. And you know, anyone you speak to in sustainability will say the same thing. You can't just offset and expect to pat yourself on the back. But when you get to the point that you've cut your emissions as much as you can, and again, I would say this is a journey, you're not going to do it overnight, then you can look at offsetting, which is looking at schemes that absorb the remaining carbon emissions. There's lots of different ways that can be done. You can invest in planting trees, which is the kind of most well-known one. Investing in renewable projects. Mangrove swamps are apparently amazing. Seagrass is incredible at absorbing carbon, but there are many, many schemes. As a company, you can pay £2 a tonne to offset carbon emissions, or you can pay £600 a tonne. Guess what? If you spend £2 a tonne, you're probably not doing much good. You're probably investing in a solar plant in India that was being built anyway. If you invest £600 a tonne, you'll probably go bankrupt, and it's probably mangrove swamps. I would suggest, and I'm not an expert in offsetting, you need to speak to companies that are regulated, and you need to speak to companies that do this for a living and ask a lot of questions. Because if you're spending any money on offsetting, you want to spend it well. Insetting is investing in carbon reduction within your supply chain. And this can be an interesting thing to do. Essentially, you're helping your suppliers reduce their carbon emissions, which if you think about it, reduces your scope 3 emissions. So, for example, a German logistics company, Schenker, bought biofuel for MSC, a big shipping company, thousands of tons of biofuel, which had already essentially produced its carbon, and therefore they were able to reduce MSC's carbon footprint and therefore reduce their own carbon footprint. So there are companies that work in insetting specifically to help, and this usually requires a computer program to help match your carbon emissions with your suppliers' carbon reduction. But as I say, they need careful thought. You need to avoid greenwashing. And really, you should be looking to only offset those emissions you can't reduce.
Jeremy, sorry, a quick one, a question. It's
Yeah.
a slight rewind. Alice Waugh out there has asked for, going back to the scope 1, 2, 3.
Yeah.
In scope 2, if you're a remote business, she
Yeah.
asks, do you have to account for energy bills at home?
Yes. Yeah, you do.
Yeah.
You do. There are some standard calculations for energy usage at home, which usually take into account electricity usage for things like computers and heating. Again, you're going to have to make estimates of how much people are working at home, but there are some standard calculations you can do. I did a calculation based on that says if you drive more than 10 miles to your office in a diesel car, it's better for the environment to work from home. So that's kind of an average, but yeah, you do if you do that. I mean, when you look at any of these scopes, and I haven't really gone into this because it sort of adds complication, but the level of granularity you can look at, it's up to you. If you've got 2 office sites or two business sites, let's say you're a chain of restaurants, so you've got 250 sites, you could actually do this exercise for each site. Or you can do it for the business as a whole. But once you've done it for the business as a whole, you can't go back and then start to cut it down, not very easily. So you need to decide when you've got a number of sites, how you look at your business. If you've got remote workers, I would suggest that you'd probably lump them up into a whole. The other thing I would mention is that, and I was going to mention this later, generally you then look at emissions based on a figure like headcount. So if you're a business that has lots of people, you might say, I'm going to look at my carbon emissions per person, not individually, but divided by the number of people. Because if you're growing, you might grow your carbon emissions, but your carbon emissions per person might come down. So you would expect your carbon emissions to grow, and that's okay as long as they're coming down per head. You might look at it versus turnover or versus number of cases you moved if you're a wholesaler, because the more cases you move, the more carbon emissions you're going to have. But if you can reduce it per case, you're on the right track. Hopefully that helps.
I mean, switching to a green energy provider is one really obvious point as well, which we did some time ago, and who are also in this case investing in wind and solar projects as well. So just as a thought, but thanks.
No, absolutely. Yeah, we'll mention a few of those later.
Sorry to jump ahead. Yeah.
No worries. So greenwashing versus green hushing. You might not have heard of green hushing. Everyone's hopefully heard of greenwashing. It is a deliberate attempt to deceive people into believing something's more sustainable than it is. Go back to those banks. Things like exaggerating environmental claims or using genuine claims in one area and implying they have a wider benefit. I saw a product the other day that said the cap was recyclable, but it didn't say anything about the rest of the packaging. And then using vague language. Things like eco-friendly with no backup data is not really acceptable these days, or green or sustainable without being very specific. And if you're a producer of a product, you might want to think about having the backup data on a website, for example, maybe with a QR code to get there, just to show people that you do have that backup data. Anytime you do calculations for these reports, you should be writing down the calculation. You should be writing down any assumptions, and you should make that transparent and freely available to people. Green hushing, though, is another area that people that companies are starting to use, and this is not a bad thing. This is companies being afraid to say what their sustainable credentials are, probably because they just want to avoid any negativity, or they don't have the ability to back it up. The problem with it is that when someone does something really good that's sustainable, we want to hear about it because it helps other companies, it helps consumers. And when brands make sustainable changes, for example, other brands are encouraged to follow because suddenly they've got a competitive advantage. It also helps educate consumers. So being transparent and talking openly about what you've done is a really good thing to do. But you just need to make sure, as I said, that it's transparent and that it's accurate. Particularly so because the Competitions and Markets Authority have just announced they're going to start to examine the accuracy of green claims. So they're looking at consumer goods initially. So, whether it be a bottle of wine or people's claims actually stack up, and make sure that shoppers aren't being misled. They will take people to court if they think that it's greenwashing, and they have said they don't care who they take to court. So if you're a retailer or a bar and you've got a product that claims to be sustainable and you're selling it, they may decide to sue you and not sue the manufacturer. I can't imagine they would do that, but that's what they've said. So if you're, let's say you've got a menu and you've got a product on that menu and you say on that menu that the product's sustainable because you've been told it is, but you haven't checked it out, then you open yourself up to legal challenge. So it is incumbent upon everybody to go back and ask questions about green claims that are being made on products. Ultimately, it's a good thing. It's going to make people be transparent and be accurate with their data. So that's all the sort of background stuff and the complicated bits. What can you actually do? So I've split this down into lots of areas. Firstly, let's start off with your carbon footprint and your energy usage. You talk to anybody in this area, the first thing they'll say to you is get a smart meter. There's a bit of negative publicity about smart meters, about people knowing how much energy you're using. But guess what? As soon as you get one, I got one a couple of months ago. I constantly look at the thing, what's using all the energy. If you're in a business, there's often something using a lot of electricity that you haven't even thought about. It might not be your PC monitors that are switched on overnight and left on 24/7. It could be just that little grey box in the corner that no one knows what it is. But once you get a smart meter, you can start to make decisions about switching things off. It's as simple as that. Switching to LED lighting. It's so obvious. It's so easy to say it. Incandescent light bulbs produce about 80% heat and about 20% light. As soon as you switch to LED, you increase your efficiency by about 80%. And they use pennies compared to incandescent light bulbs. So they're really, really useful. They're not cheap to start with, although they're getting cheaper, but it will cut your electricity consumption overnight. Turn down your heating by 1 or 2 degrees, or open windows rather than air conditioning. They're obvious. One of the big ones, and this is huge, and no one even thinks about it, is install insulation. If you've got buildings that are badly insulated, you will just be heating up the atmosphere and pumping carbon dioxide into the air. It's one of the cheapest ways to reduce your energy usage. And I'd say do that at home as well. It's really cheap and it really does save you money. Andrew mentioned consider changing to a renewable electricity supplier. There are a number of them out there. There's Good Energy, there's Octopus, there's a number of others. They show you how all their energy comes from renewables. They also invest in renewables. If you change for a renewable electricity supplier, you have got almost not exactly a zero carbon footprint on your electricity. You will have a carbon footprint, but it'll be much smaller than buying through one of the standard suppliers. Also, look at your tariffs. It's not an energy saving thing; it's a cost saving thing. But look at your tariffs to see if you've got a fleet of electric vehicles, for example, you might be better on economy 7 and charging them up overnight. It's not going to save you electricity, but it'll save you money. We all fell in love and then out of love with Zoom and Google and Teams over the pandemic, but video conferencing obviously is going to save you on travel by car and by air. Also, it's going to save you time if you're not driving to a meeting, but you've got a couple of hours extra to do some work. So it is an energy saver, although obviously there is a cost to it in terms of electricity. When buying anything new, electricals, for example, look at the energy efficiency. The scale of energy efficiency changed recently because things are becoming more efficient. Things that used to be efficiency level A are now much less efficient because there's other more efficient things coming into the market. But do look at the energy efficiency. It might not be something you consider when you buy new things, but that fridge or that freezer or whatever you've got sat in the corner burning electricity 24/7, if you make the right decision, you can save money and cut your emissions. Use local suppliers where you can. This is more your scope 3 because this is things you're buying into your business, but using local suppliers definitely going to cut down on transport. And then public transport where possible. Trains are the very best choice of public transport in the UK currently for cutting carbon emissions. And this is all about your staff travel. Aeroplanes are pretty bad, but sometimes you have to use them. But anything is better than a car. So they're the sort of relatively immediate things you can do to cut energy usage and also cut your greenhouse gas emissions and cut costs. There are some things you can do which require investment and are a bit harder and a bit more long term, but consider installing renewables. Solar power matches really well with office hours. Solar power works really from when the sun comes up until it goes down. It doesn't work very well at night or at all. So if you're running an office or a business that runs 9 to 5-ish, then solar power is really good for you. If you're running a bar that does most of its business from sort of 7 o'clock to 11, 12 o'clock, then solar power isn't going to help you with those hours. But one thing that does make solar power work overnight is batteries. If you install batteries with solar, most systems now are offered with batteries. You charge the battery up during the day and you use it overnight. So that they can work really, really well. And you can finance solar power over a long period. So it's not all about upfront costs, but obviously there's a cost to it, and there's a cost to the energy saving, and it's a big decision. You could offer a cycle to work scheme. You might need to provide changing facilities or an area for people to change, but you can save the VAT and on a bike, and then staff can save tax at 20% on a bike. Fairly easy to sign up to. You don't have to. People can buy the bike; they don't have to cycle to work with it. No one checks, but it is a good way again of cutting down on employee commuting, and that does cover electric bikes as well. And one of the other things you can do is, if you do have a company car scheme or a company car allowance, is considering offering an electric vehicle scheme in place of that. You'll pay less as a business on expenses if someone's got an electric vehicle, but obviously it cuts down on your carbon emissions almost immediately. There are some emissions associated with the charging, as we mentioned before, but again, if you've got renewables and you're charging on solar power, there's no emissions. But even if you're charging overnight on economy 7, it's much more efficient than using a diesel car or a petrol car. But these things are much longer term things, maybe not so much the cycle to work scheme. There are many more. Hopefully I've just sort of shown you a snapshot there. But if you reduce your energy usage as a business, you will save money. It's as simple as that. And with energy costs as they are, you'll save a lot. I changed electricity companies recently, and they showed me the non-supported cost. I think at the moment we're paying 35p a unit. The non-supported cost is something like 60p a unit if the government weren't supporting energy costs. So it's going to be huge in the future. Good. Okay, so that's energy. Water and waste. Water, there are water saving devices you can install in your business. Things like flow restrictors on taps, and they don't have to be replacements. They can be added onto existing taps. Automatic taps, obviously, are replacements where they stay on for a certain amount of time. You can install system bags or twin flush systems in your toilets. If you've got a business that uses a lot of water in other ways, then you might need a more bespoke solution. So it's difficult to say what more you can do on water depending on whether you're a business that uses a lot. Waste, though, there's an awful lot you can do. It's a fairly simple thing. It's a controversial thing, but if you take all your waste paper bins under desks in an office, that's a good start, because people chuck everything in them. And I'm going to suggest that if you do that, you get the managing director to do it as well, because he won't want to get up, or she won't want to get up and go to the recycling system. But everyone needs to buy into this. And then what you need is a recycling system somewhere in your business where you can recycle things separately. So paper, for example, plastics, food waste. And there are lots of local recycling projects where you can perhaps supply local stables with shredded paper, for example. So you need a champion in your business, really, if you're going to go down this route, to look for these kind of things and push these kind of things. Removing single-use cups. You might have a water fountain in your business with plastic cups. If you take those plastic cups away and everyone has their own cup, you'll cut your waste immediately. There's other things you can do with water. Many years ago, in a business I worked in, we had a plumbed-in water filter that was plumbed into the mains. So there was no plastic bottles delivered to the office. There was no need to store these huge plastic bottles full and empty. And also the thing heated water, there was always hot water available. So there's lots of things you can do around that area to cut waste and cut emissions. If you've got coffee machines, there's a scheme called Podback, which most of the big companies are involved with, where you can recycle those coffee pods. And they get washed and refilled. Documents, only print them when necessary. We still all do that. Andrew nearly printed something earlier, I noticed, rather than read it off the screen. But we all do it. And then use recycled materials where possible. So paper in offices, office furniture, you can save a fortune. Companies like Reuse, fantastic quality product, second-hand office tables, chairs, cupboards for peanuts, second-hand, to save using new ones. Printer cartridges can be recycled. Office cleaning products or premises cleaning products can be in recycled packaging, but also environmentally friendly products. So there's a huge amount of things you can do around waste. I mean, really just scratch the surface. What you need to do is look at all your waste in your business and understand whether you can reduce it or not and how you can reduce it. But if you just Google things, there's loads of companies out there offering recycling. If you put all your certain waste together, they'll take it away and recycle it for you. As I said before, the target is to reduce your percentage going to landfill. So it's what you would normally put in your waste paper basket that goes in the normal bin. That's the stuff you want to try and reduce.
Just in mitigation, Jeremy, of the almost printing of the paper, the A4 earlier, I did act on your advice to remove start removing waste paper baskets in the office, and it's just amazing. It's a short trip for people, and it seems like such a small thing. It's almost silly, but incrementally these things can make so much difference. Just as an observation. So
yeah, good. Yeah, not always popular, but
no,
people get used to it. I'm going to look at sort of a more specific area here, like drinks packaging. So if you're a producer, this is more relevant. But if you're a retailer or a bar, this is probably interesting, and you should be asking your suppliers to do these things. So if you take drinks packaging, so some sort of alcohol or non-alcoholic product in a bottle, in a cardboard container, and then shipped probably from the other side of the world to your premises via a number of different warehouses. Glass, one of the biggest contributors to carbon footprint. 100% recycled glass, which you can't buy incidentally in the UK, not very easily, produces 42% fewer carbon emissions than virgin glass. Basically, when you recycle glass, the furnace doesn't have to be as hot to melt that glass. That's as simple as it is. So what you'll find is, for example, Allied glass, they're not called Allied anymore, but their standard glass is something like 62% recycled. Their premium glass is 100% virgin. So if you're producing new products, think about it right at the start. What kind of glass am I going to use for this product? There are glass bottles out there you can buy that are 100% recycled. They're not completely clear. They haven't got a completely smooth surface. They look absolutely fantastic. There's a company called Wild Glass, I think they're in France, that do that. It looks beautiful, actually, and I think would enhance any product. Lightweight glass is a huge saver on carbon emissions, and also not just in terms of production, but also on the transport costs. If you cut down the weight of a glass from 800 grams to 400 grams a bottle, it's going to save 50% of your carbon emissions straight away, just on the production, and then you're going to transport it more liquid and less glass, therefore more bottles on the pallet. It's going to cut down your costs and your emissions straight away. And then obviously there are other materials you could consider, and we'll look at a couple in a minute. Cardboard and paper, there's only a smallish saving in CO2 emissions by using recycled board, but there is a saving. But again, it's good for your environmental credentials if all your cardboard cartons are made from recycled paper or recycled card. Things like tape and glue. You can use paper tapes for sealing cartons. You don't have to use plastic tape. And for marketeers out there, you can get those branded as well. And you can use different glues like bio-based glues if you're gluing your cartons. I would say avoid polystyrene at all costs. Even 20 years ago, when I worked for Marks and Spencer's, they rejected any wine samples that were delivered in polystyrene casing. It can be recycled. It's very difficult to recycle. It's not really recycled. It just goes into the environment, and it uses a lot of oil in its production as well. So please try and avoid polystyrene in packaging. If you're sending anything out that needs to be protected, you can use shredded paper. Even those inflatable bags that are plastic are better than polystyrene. But polystyrene, yeah, nasty stuff. And then any other plastics you need to consider really carefully, whether you can use recycled, whether they are recyclable, and what else can be used. I mean, for example, if you imagine a nice luxury gift box with one of those little round plastic seals that just goes over the opening, those can be made from paper and they can look like plastic. They can be made from seaweed and they look like plastic. They don't cost much, and moving to a non-plastic alternative is not really very expensive. This is a massive subject though, packaging. Huge subject. Looking at other formats, there's a canifesto, sorry, instead of a manifesto, currently been launched by a group of brands that are in cans they're trying to persuade the on-trade that products in cans should be considered due to convenience. So for example, a wine delivered in a can, which it's a one-shot serve, therefore it's going to be fresh every time. But we don't think people get a drink in a can. They almost think it needs to be drunk in a can. It doesn't. It can be decanted. One watch out though: aluminium cans. They are the most recycled product in the world, or one of the most recycled products in the world. It can take 6 weeks from a can to be bought from a retailer to be back on the shelf, having been recycled and filled again. It's much more environmentally friendly to recycle aluminium than it is to produce it from new. But the growth in aluminium cans is so big that we're having to mine and produce more virgin aluminium, and that is obviously causing environmental problems. So yes, they're very good, but you have to think of the knock-on effects. The Sustainable Spirit Company, they offer products in 2.8 litre refillable pouches, which is 4 bottles. The idea being that you in a bar would buy the pouch, you'd refill the original bottle so that the branding is still there at the point of purchase, but it saves you space and it cuts emissions, and it maintains branding at the point of purchase. The pouch then goes back to be reused or recycled back to the Sustainable Spirit Co. So there's a couple of examples. There are lots of other examples. There's paper bottles now, huge number of examples. But I did hear that the paper bottle experiment, and I don't know if there's anybody on from Greenall's, but Greenall's gin went into Sainsbury's in a paper bottle and still the glass bottle, and everyone picked up the glass bottle. So it's quite brave sometimes to move to an alternative packaging. And then when you look at your supply chain, if you think about products and not including packaging, carbon footprint calculations are incredibly complicated for food and drinks. It's really hard to work out on a bottle of rum what the carbon emissions are, because you don't know where necessarily all that's come from. Most of the products that we use in our industry are farmed in origin. Even if they've been distilled, they came from an agricultural product. And the biggest contributors to agricultural emissions are machinery and fertilizers. But you don't know when you buy something how much tractors have been used, how much fertilizer has been used. Processing product involves fermentation and distillation. Fermentation gives off carbon dioxide, distillation uses heat. Water usage could be significant, and you're not going to have any influence over any of this, and you're not going to be able to get primary data. So it's very, very hard for you to get this information from a supplier. What you can do is you can choose products that are more local, depending on your business, and you can also produce products that are more sustainable, and that's, sorry, a vague term, where people have started to look at their environmental impact and started to cut it down. So you can have influence, but it's very, very hard to work out exactly what your carbon footprint is on a bought-in product. And I would suggest that you think hard about that. I've seen quotes of £10,000 per product to work out the end-to-end full life carbon emissions on, say, a bottle of wine or a tin of tuna or whatever it might be. So it's very expensive at the moment to get this data, which is why I say, if you're looking at your emissions, draw a line around your business and say, well, look at these bits because these are the bits we can influence, but we're not going to look at this stuff over here because we don't have the information. Transport, though, shipping into your business, whether something comes in by lorry or it comes in by ship or however it comes in, those transport emissions are quite well understood. And in the government tables, all the information's there, and figures are available for most methods of transport. And you can influence the method you use. Again, if I go back to my M&S days 20 years ago, they were shipping in all their champagne by train rather than truck because it reduced carbon emissions. But what you can't do is you can't change the shipping industry. You are not going to be able to very easily influence the carbon emissions of the ships that bring stuff to the UK and the lorries that deliver to your business. But again, look at wholesalers. Some wholesalers are now starting to use electric vehicles. Are you going to switch wholesalers based on the fact that that's a more environmentally sustainable thing to do? You can also make smart choices if you're a producer. And I did this calculation for Andrew, so you'll correct me, Andrew, if I've got the figure wrong, but bulk shipments of wine, for example, save around 50% on emissions versus shipping bottles. And that's because you're not shipping glass, you're just shipping the liquid in a big bladder. You can get more in a container, and therefore the emissions per bottle of wine are reduced by about 50%. So you can influence the carbon footprint, but you're not going to ship Bordeaux or Champagne or Rioja in bulk because you can't legally do it. So there are some restrictions around that. But if you're producing beverage alcohol, cheaper mass market wines, then you can certainly do that. So some of those things, this is where it gets slightly difficult, and you're not always going to have influence over these areas, and you're not going to be able to have the information actually about some of these areas. And then if you go through this process, you'll produce a sustainability report. And so on the left at the top there is what your carbon footprint might look like. And I would encourage you to look at businesses that do this really well. And you'll see that they've put their actual numbers on their report, and look at, there are businesses out there that do this quite well and say that we're doing these 10 things to reduce our carbon emissions, but they don't give you any numbers. But ideally what you need to get to is a situation where you've got some numbers that say, here's my base year 2022, here are my actual scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions. Scope 3 will always be your biggest. And here's my 2026 target, for example. Now, if you're going to create a target, you need to have an actionable plan of things you're going to do to hit that target. It can't just be, oh, let's hope we can get it down by 50%, because you need to know how you're going to do it. But this is the kind of thing you might put on a report. You might put what your total carbon footprint is, 117 tons of CO2 equivalent. And then you might, as I said, put it per employee or per unit or per pound of turnover, because if you're growing your business, then you might expect that to go up, but it might go down per unit. And then you might have a waste number that 75% of your waste goes to landfill, not in Andrew's office. And then you might have some plans of things you're going to do. Switch to green tariff electricity might save you 35 tons. Introduce incentives for zero emissions company cars. Recycling scheme within the business. Switch from disposable cups. Switch from bottled water to office filter to reduce waste. So you might have a number of actions you're going to do there to reduce. And if you look around at companies that do this well, this is the kind of information that they'll have on a report. But all this will be backed up by data, because just going back to that point about transparency, you need to say to people, this is how I've made this calculation. I haven't mentioned it yet, but there are lots of companies out there that have carbon calculators, and some of them are free. So search around on the internet, you'll find some free ones. The free ones tend to not go into too much detail. If you do it yourself, you'll have to rely on doing lots of calculations yourself. But again, there are companies that provide software very cheaply that you plug in. And I would say, if you've got a finance team in your business, if you're big enough to have a finance department, they are the people that should be doing this. In the same way that measuring sales, when a salesperson does it, they might tweak the figure up. The finance team tend to be quite ruthless, and they'll be telling you the real numbers. So these are the kind of things anyway that you might put out on a report. And then finally, I would just leave you with some thoughts. Look at what you can control versus what you can influence. Start with the things you can control, but work on the things you can influence. All your suppliers will currently be being asked about their carbon footprint. So don't be afraid to ask. They're already being asked. And when I've asked people, when I've worked with companies and asked their suppliers, usually they've got figures to hand because everyone else is asking them as well. Look at what you can do now, particularly on that energy slide, the things above the line were things you can do immediately and fairly cheaply, because the things you can do cheaply are obviously the most attractive things right now. What's going to save you money without a big investment? And then I've reiterated this a few times, but it is a journey, and it does take time and effort. It's not to be taken lightly. We did a session a while back on sustainability in the boardroom, didn't we, Andrew? And really what everyone said is this is a cultural change, and like any cultural change, it takes time, it takes effort. You're going to slide backwards, but don't worry about that. Once you've started this process, you can incorporate it into every business decision. So if you're going to produce a new product, if you're a producer, then you can think about, okay, what can I do to build sustainability into this product? If you're going to open a new premises, you might be looking at a premises that has good insulation. Or if you're going to install equipment, you might then look at how energy hungry is that equipment. So once you've started this process, your future decisions will be better. Data, though, is important. You're going to need to quantify what you do, because if you start making claims about your sustainability credentials, people will ask you questions, and you're going to need at some point to have that data backup. And there's lots of help out there. Harper's Sustainability Charter, Sustainable Wine Roundtable if you're in the wine business. There's lots of online resources. You'll be surprised how much competitors will help you. And they've been on panels with Harper's giving advice for free, because people who are into sustainability want everybody else to be as well. So competitors will help you. Your suppliers can help you. They're already being asked these questions, as I said, and you'd be surprised how much information they've got. My plea is that you're transparent and accurate. Don't make spurious claims. You could end up in court. And finally, start somewhere. Do something now, because the first step is the hardest bit. But even if you just phone your electricity company and get a smart meter put in, that it doesn't cost you anything. They'll do it for free. And straight away you can start looking at your energy usage and your carbon emissions. So start today, please.
Yeah, and thank you, Jeremy.
That, I think, Andrew.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. And I think that's a really superb, balanced and insightful look into what sustainability is, what it involves, and what you can do about it yourselves as a business, and indeed individuals. It's down to all of us, isn't it? So, and I thought some really key points at the end there, because we opened with, this is a complex subject, even within the sort of three pillars. There are just myriad pathways, I suppose, that you can and should end up advancing down. But it's not as daunting once you actually sort of step into that world. It becomes less daunting and things become, I think, a little more habitual. And as you said, the webinar we were both on the other day, and I say there's free resources, Harper's YouTube channel, there's plenty of other stuff out there online. But if you can visit that as well. The Sustainability Charter, thanks for mentioning. I mean, the whole point of that is about sharing and transparency. And we've had one or two companies, notably, who have been a little reticent about signing up. It's just taking a little bit of persuasion, but their reticence has been, well, we haven't really gone that far down our own sustainability path. How will we look compared with others? And it's no, the fact that you are actually being transparent and saying we're starting and we're moving from this point onwards is what it's about. It's not a competition, it's a collective kind of move, basically. And that's, I think, really, really important. So yes, we've got a few questions, which I will throw out to you on various topics. One I might answer myself, actually. So one is, it's difficult as a small business to be as loud as bigger companies, even if and when one is doing something sustainable. Brackets and PR people are expensive, with a smiley. Just wondering, I suppose part of what I've just said actually is that's why we set up. I don't keep plugging a Harper's Sustainability Charter, but then there are other people doing great things out there. But that it's free. It's free to sign up, and as long as you've got bona fide sustainable, you're moving down sustainable pathways, and it's not greenwash, then that's part of the point. It's a platform. It's transparent. It's so that you can share what you're doing with people up and down the supply chain, with consumers, and so on. But Jeremy, any thoughts about that? I mean, sort of shouting out your sustainable progress.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to know exactly what the challenge is there, but what I would say is, an awful lot of businesses have websites. So put your report on your website, put your plans on your website, be open and transparent about that. You can talk about it. I mean, if you go down this route, everybody in a business needs to be behind it. So employees can talk about it to customers and to other stakeholders. Yes, it is hard to broadcast it, but I don't think necessarily it is about broadcasting it. I think it's about making sure that if you produce a product that's sustainable, you can put messages on the product. So there are lots of places you can put these messages. So, I mean, unless there's a sort of more specific question, it's difficult to say how you can sort of out shout the large companies. But, I don't know, if you look at, I mean, Diageo is the biggest company in our industry. If you look at their website, they've got lots of things on their website, but I'm not aware that they broadcast their sustainable credentials in any other way. So if you're a restaurant, you can put things on your menus. There's lots of places you can put information. Use social media. Put things on there as well. If you're a business and you've done something really good, or you've achieved a goal, or you've set a target, put it on your social media. It's just as relevant as talking about your new menu or a new cocktail or a new product. put it on the social media.
It's a really good point. I mean, if nothing else, it will make an increasing and now awful number of your consumers happier to be dealing with you. I think it's as simple as that, and it's flipped over, hasn't it? That's what we were talking about the other day, Jeremy. That we've sort of crossed a Rubicon in a sense. I think from it's not kind of are you sustainable, but the question rapidly is becoming why aren't you sustainable? So great. Sorry, yeah. Okay, Christina Album asks, hi Christina, in terms of getting solar, I know we were just preempting before we opened, is there any questions we can't answer? Jeremy's happy to do the research and come back to you.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
So in terms of getting solar, I was recently told that installing a solar PV system can impact on the rateable value of the site for the purpose of business rates and the structure of how it's operated. It was recommended professional tax advice is sought for advancing a solar PV project. Can you give us a bit more info on that? Is it something to worry about? Is that something that comes within your knowledge?
I know a little bit about solar PV. I've also installed it myself. I don't know about the business rates. I'll find out. I'm not a tax advisor, so it's definitely not something I can advise on, but I will look at the if I can find out about the rateable value and let you know. In terms of sort of how much is used and exported, what I go back to what I said before. I would never put solar in without putting batteries in, because you'll produce solar even in the winter. And in fact, solar panels work better in cooler weather, but they do work better when it's sunny and not cloudy. But you will produce solar on a cloudy day in the winter. But if your usage goes into the evenings, you're much better getting batteries as well, so that you can charge those batteries on using the solar energy and then use them in the evenings. Also, you can charge those batteries overnight on cheap electricity, although it doesn't cut your carbon emissions. But I will look into the rateable value side of it, because I don't know. And it's always quite difficult when you can install solar on a rented building, but it's always much harder.
Yeah, okay, great, thanks. So Christina, you can you can mail me andrew.catchpole@agilemedia.co.uk. It's also my emails on the Harper's website, so I can pass questions on to Jeremy. So that's great. One final question at the moment, if anyone else wants to sneak one or two in. I know Jeremy can offer a little more of his time, but it's Alex. Hi, Alex, from Chilled and Tannin Wine Merchants. This is on regarding consumer perception of greenwashing. So we know at Harper's that Chilled and Tannin have done quite a lot on the sustainability front and continue to do so. But Alex is saying we've been planting a tree for every order for 2 years with an ethically audited provider. I can't speak today. That's Ecologi, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. But we're concerned with increasing public perception that planting trees is an easy way to greenwash. So Alex's question specifically is, what types of green projects do you feel will be the best to invest into in the coming years? So, renewable projects rather than trees. Any thoughts?
Yeah. So first of all, Ecologi, this is where, so what they do is they use an average. So if you go on their website and tell them how many employees you've got, they'll tell you how many trees need planting to cover those employees. But what they don't ask is, are those employees traveling, thousands of miles on airplanes every year, or are they just sitting in an office? So it is about averages with Ecologi. And the one thing I would say is, you probably don't know, you might know, and forgive me if you do, you don't know when you send an order out what your impact is on the environment of that transport, and therefore whether that tree offsets it. Also with trees, there is a big debate about how much carbon they actually sequester. They certainly don't sequester a lot when they're planted initially. They sequester a lot more when they're mature. So what I would say to you is, great, that's what you're doing. And if you say we're planting a tree for every order, that's fantastic. People like that, and you're being really honest, and you're being transparent, you're being open. But what you're not saying is that tree is offsetting the carbon emissions from that order, and you mustn't say that because you don't know. So what you really need to do, if you want to do that, is you need to work out, and you can do it on an average order, is work out what your emissions are for your deliveries, and then find out how to cover that in terms of offsetting. Ecology tend to only talk to you if you're a big business. Otherwise, it's all done on their website. So if you want to really get into offsetting properly, first of all, you're going to need to work out what your carbon emissions actually are. And then you're going to need to go to an offsetting company that is going to engage with you and talk about the different projects you can use. In terms of the best one, I'm not an expert in offsetting. Personally, I like the idea of insetting. I like the idea of talking to your suppliers and seeing how you can help them offset, which and use your investment that way. Because if you're doing something that involves your supply chain, it's quite close to your heart. If you're obviously selling wine, you can do something with a wine supplier. It's going to feel like a nicer piece of work than if you're just buying trees or you know, as I say, a solar plant in India, which you'll never visit. So I would look at some insetting as a good place to start. Nothing wrong with what you're doing. Absolutely fantastic. But you can't make any claims other than we're planting a tree for every order.
Okay, Alex, hopefully that's helpful, and keep up the good work. And Alex also says thanks, Jeremy, for a great webinar. Just pass that.
No worries. I mean, if Alex wants to contact me direct, I'm happy to have a chat on the phone.
Yeah, sure. Great.
Yeah.
Great. Okay, fantastic. So one more question here in the Q&A box, and it's Lucinda Colucci. Hi, Lucinda. Thanks for your question. So she is asking, on our site, we are considering replacing oil with heat exchangers. Is funding available? Again,
I'm assuming that means air source or ground source heating.
I'm not sure, actually. Sorry, Lucinda. Or you could quickly tap in a clarification there. So
I believe there is funding available. I don't know if it's just domestic or business, but I will find out. Oil, incidentally, at the moment, it's the cheapest way to heat anything. Unfortunately, because of the price of oil, the price of gas, oil is the cheapest way. Your electricity bill will go up if you put in ground source or air source, because it does use electricity, but your overall heating bill should go down if you combine the two. And then if you were to combine that with some renewables, like a solar panels, you can reduce it further. But I'll find out about funding. But I believe there is some funding available, but I think it might just be on domestic. I'll find out.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, and yeah, thank you, Lucinda. And she's just come back and said thank you.
Thank you.
An inspiring webinar, which I think it certainly has been. So, well, I think, Jeremy, I don't know if there are any concluding remarks from you, but I think you rather have done all the heavy lifting today, which is fine by me, but it's been covered an awful lot of ground very, very clearly, and hopefully it's inspired a few people out there and also answered some questions. So it's really good. For those, and I've already had requests in advance, I mentioned before we have Harper's YouTube channel. Just look for Harper's Wine and Spirits channel on YouTube, and this will appear there, and it's a resource that you can share with colleagues that may not have been able to make it along. So please do think of that, and or go back and refer to sections, and it's all up there. So and that's great. And as I say, any questions come via me, andrew.catchpole@agilemedia.co.uk, and I will pass them on to Jeremy, who kindly will be in touch with you. So that's great. So Jeremy, thank you very, very much for this this webinar. That's brilliant.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much all for joining us.
Thanks.
See you in person soon. Okay. All right. Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Bye for now.